Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Samuel Blumenfeld will be our speaker this afternoon. Now, he's not a stranger to these meetings. Generally he's speaking on the topic of education. Sam is, I would say, he's a pioneer in the modern homeschool movement. He's authored numerous books. He's traveled all over the United States, all 50 states, and in most of the English-speaking world, discussing the problems with public education and the solutions through homeschooling in Christian schools, etc. Sam is a regular at homeschool conventions. He's been on TV, radio. He has had his articles published in numerous magazines and so forth. And he did ask me about if he could speak on his new book that he's got out. And I thought, a new book on education, that's great. He said, no, it's called the Marlowe-Shakespeare Connection, dealing with who authored Shakespeare. So it is our pleasure to introduce Samuel Blumenfeld. Sam.
Hello. Thank you, Hal, for that introduction. I'm delighted that you're here. You are the chosen few who have come to enjoy what I consider to be a very important subject. And the title of my talk really is Reflections on Genius, or Who Wrote Shakespeare? Now, I'm rather curious. How many of you are aware or even know something about the Shakespeare authorship question? Yeah. Good many of you. How many of you have heard of Christopher Marlowe, or have read, good, that's terrific. Well, a younger audience would know much less. Because I have talked to a lot of young college graduates who never heard of Christopher Marlowe. And of course the reason for that is obvious, that they have been, dumbing down the young people in this country to the extent where they don't even realize that the past exists. They have such a strange view of it's just full of fantasy. And so when it comes to the Shakespeare authorship question, it means that we are not even introducing the younger generation to the genius and beauty of the past. That's true. There's a tremendous amount of beauty and genius in the past which the young people don't know about. What they are required to read in their English courses are mediocrities written in the last, 30 or 40 years by writers with ethnic backgrounds or feminist backgrounds.
J.D. Salinger.
Right. In other words, they're not reading the great classics. Now, the Shakespeare authorship issue is really one about genius. For the writer of the 36 plays in the first folio was the greatest literary genius in all of human history. So you're dealing with a formidable individual. And that is why readers, playgoers, and scholars throughout the ages have been so interested in this unique human being. The same is true of Mozart. Biographies have been written about Mozart. We know all about Mozart. We don't believe that somebody else wrote Mozart. Mozart wrote Mozart. Well, we want to know a lot more about this man Shakespeare because he was the greatest literary genius in all of human history. And all you have to do is read the plays to come to that conclusion yourself. You don't need somebody else to tell you that. You start reading those plays, and what I would advise you to do, by the way, if you have nothing better to do, is to start reading the 36 plays. But of course, you should first read Marlowe's works. See, the only way that you can show the connection between the two is to first read Marlowe's plays. Now, what did he write? He translated Ovid. And he did a beautiful translation of Ovid, and one of the poems, incidentally, is an anti-abortion poem that he wrote. Can you imagine back in
Wow.
1500s, they were all already concerned about abortion.
Wow.
He was very anti-abortion. And then he wrote, his first play was Dido, Queen of Carthage, which was about Aeneas, who escaped from the destruction in Troy, got to Carthage, met Queen Dido. She fell in love with him, and she wanted him to stay, but he decided to leave, and he left for Italy and founded the Roman Republic, I suppose, you know. But in any case, there's a great story there, and even an opera has been written about Dido. Now, the reason why I mentioned Dido is because you will find references to Dido virtually throughout all of those Shakespeare plays. Marlowe used that as one of the clues. You see, that's how he managed to make sure that future generations would realize that he was the writer of these plays, because he planted clues in each play. So you have to read all of the plays in order to get the clues. But in order to know the clues, you first have to read Marlowe. So first you read Dido. Won't take you very long to read that, a day or two. Then you have to read Tamburlaine, which was his great masterpiece, which shocked the British stage. You know, the Elizabethan theater was a very vibrant industry, and writers had to write plays by the dozens, because it was like today's movie theaters. You have to have a new movie every week, you know, or every couple of weeks, and so Hollywood is churning them out. Well, they had the same situation in Elizabethan England. You had the theaters that had to keep putting on new plays, and you had writers churning them out. And it's interesting that a diary of one of the producers, Henslow, it's called Henslow's Diary. So he was a producer, he had a theater, and he kept a record of the plays that were produced, and also of the writers that he paid advances to. And you would find groups of writers writing plays. It was like a little, you know, just like in Hollywood, where a bunch of people, in Hollywood you don't have one author who writes a movie script. You got a half a dozen people working on it. Well, it was the same thing in Elizabethan times. You had a half a dozen, 3 or 4 writers working on a play. They got an advance from Henslow, and they created the play. Well, in all of Henslow's diary, there is no mention of William Shakespeare. And this shocked even the man, Collier, who was the one who put together all of this in the Shakespeare Society that was created in England. No mention of Shakespeare. Well, so rather odd that since he was the greatest of them all, how come his name isn't mentioned when the plays the titles of the plays are in the diary, but no mention of the author. Well, so that's the kind of thing, that's why you have to read the 36 plays. What I would advise you to do is get a good edition of the first folio plays, the 36 plays, and just start going through them leisurely. And you will, first of all, you'll enjoy them because of their great beauty, the poetry, etc. And also, you learn so much. Marlowe was a very, very smart person, very well educated. Marlowe went to the King's School in Canterbury, which was the prep school of the time, where he learned Latin and Greek and all the classics. He learned how to write. Then he was in Cambridge for 6 years. He was a student at Cambridge University, and one of the things that they did at Cambridge was they used a dialectical system in teaching the students how to argue both sides of the story. So in other words, you can argue, yes, that the Bible is correct and it is the truth, and then you could take the other side, no, the Bible is not the truth, you see. So they were trained to work in both, in this dialectical fashion. Also, They also were educated and trained in how to write verse. It was not easy writing verse. It was not an easy thing to make sure that all of these things rhymed, and you'll find in the plays a tremendous amount of great verse, and you had to know how to do it. Now, so we know about Marlowe's education. Very well educated, very smart. He was obviously a prodigy. Obviously a prodigy. And in fact, if you go back into his early childhood, he was brought up in a common family. His father was a cobbler, that is a shoemaker. And he was brought up in the town of Canterbury, which was the ecclesiastical capital of England at the time. It still is, I believe. You have the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's the top man in the Anglican Church. And he was born shortly after Elizabeth took the throne. His father, as I say, was a cobbler. Then the biographies of Marlowe, which are the traditional ones where they accept the idea that he was dead at age 29 in 1593, that he was killed in this barroom brawl. They accept that. And then they have this gap. They say, we don't know where he was or what he was doing from the age 8 to 14, because we know at the age of 14 he entered the King's School. But we don't know what he was doing from 8 to 14. Well, I'll tell you what he was doing. He was a page. Now, in those days, an 8-year-old was eligible to become a page. And he was a very smart kid, and probably it was well known in the community that he was a genius, this little genius. And there are such things as these prodigies, you know. As a matter of fact, if you want to see an actual youthful genius on YouTube, just go to the YouTube site for Oliver Aldort. Oliver Aldort is a 13-year-old, he's probably 14 by now, pianist and cellist who performs one of Mozart's piano concertos, and it's astonishing. Astonishing to see this young kid who can, you know, who has to heighten the seat that he's sitting on and sits on the edge, and you can actually see his fingers going over that piano in a remarkable way. At the age of 13, he plays like a 75-year-old. I mean, he's got that feeling, he's got that understanding of the music. That's genius, you see. Well, Marlowe was a genius. There was no question about it. And he attracted the attention probably of the Archbishop there, who was a friend of Lord Burleigh. They needed somebody to go on the continent with Sir Philip Sidney, who was then 17, and was embarking on a 2-year tour of the continent. And in those days, young noblemen usually went on a tour of the continent to learn languages and to get to know the political scene outside of England. And of course, this was during the period when there was the great conflict between Protestants and Catholics. And so it was a very politically charged period. Well, where did Philip Sidney go? And where did he take his page with him? First he went to Paris. And what happened in Paris while they were there? The famous St. Bartholomew Massacre. St. Bartholomew Day Massacre, in which the Protestant, you see, the Protestant leadership had come to Paris to witness the marriage of their queen's daughter, the King of Navarre's daughter, to the King of France, or the prince, and the Dauphin. And so all of the Protestant leadership was in Paris at the time, and the king's mother, I think her name, Margaret of Medici, de Medici, said, this is a wonderful opportunity for us to kill off the Protestant leadership. And so they staged this incredible massacre. And Philip Sidney was there in Paris at the time, staying at the home of the British ambassador, who was Sir Francis Walsingham, the head of Queen Elizabeth's Secret Service, you see. And they witnessed this. And of course, years later, Marlowe wrote a play entitled Massacre at Paris. And he knew all the details, details which you had to be there to know, you see. Well, then they traveled all over Europe. After they left Paris, they went to Germany, they went to Austria, and they went to Italy, to Venice, to Padua. And as you know, many of the plays, of Shakespeare's plays, take place in Padua, Venice, you know, The Merchant of Venice, etc. And you have Italians. As a matter of fact, I just found something on the internet from a Italian professor in Venice who says you had to have been in Venice to have been able to write the way Shakespeare wrote. You had to have been there. And we know that there's no indication that Shakespeare went anywhere outside of England, you see. So, but we know that Marlowe must have gone. Well, anyway, Marlowe then and Philip Sidney returned to England. Philip Sidney was later killed in the Netherlands at the Battle of Zutphen. And Marlowe then Marlowe got to know Philip Sidney's sister, Mary Sidney. Now, Mary Sidney was 2 years older than Marlowe. And when he was 15 and she was 17, something very interesting happened. First of all, Mary Sidney, at the age of 15, married this elderly Earl of Pembroke. And that made her the Countess of Pembroke. Now, the interesting thing about the Earl of Pembroke is that he had had 2 marriages and no children. And they were married for 2 years, the elderly Earl and young Mary, and they had no children. Now, the Earl wanted an heir. Obviously, he was infertile. He wanted an heir. Now, how could he get an heir? He probably told Mary, he said, listen, I want an heir. Be very discreet. I don't want to know who you choose, you know, to give you this child. And so, who did she look for? Who did she find to impregnate her? Here was young Marlowe, who had been her brother's page, handsome, very intelligent, attending the school right there in Canterbury. She lived in Penshurst, which was not too far away. Somehow they got together, and he was the perfect person for the job. Why? He was unknown. He was a commoner. He was a nothing. He was a social nothing. And out of that, you would say, out of that union came the next Earl of Pembroke. It's very interesting to know, see that line, because we find out in 1623, as one of the sponsors for the first folio was the Earl of Pembroke, you see. It's interesting how you see the timeline in this story. Well, anyway, so she gives birth to this young child, the Earl of Pembroke. She also knows that Marlowe is a great writer, so she gets her husband to create an acting troupe. In those days, a group of actors had to have the sponsorship of a noble individual of the aristocracy. And so he created Pembroke's Men. And it was probably run by his wife. You know, she was the one who was interested in the theater. And so they produced Marlowe's plays, Pembroke's Men. This was before he was had his so-called murder, before that took place. So then Marlowe, when he was in Cambridge, was recruited into Elizabeth's Secret Service as a spy, you see. Now, there he is, this commoner, son of a cobbler, winds up at Cambridge on a scholarship, And here he hobnobs with all of the upper class, the aristocracy, and he's taken in by Sir Francis Walsingham and by Lord Burleigh, the two top men in Elizabeth's government, because they know he is very intelligent, they know he is a great writer, and that he can, and also he would make a great spy. And his mission, they sent him on a mission from Cambridge to the Catholic English Seminary in Reims, France. And he infiltrated there to find out what was going on, because during this period there were all sorts of plots to assassinate Elizabeth. You see, the Catholics wanted to retake the British throne. And there was Mary, Queen of Scots, who was there in the wings waiting to become Queen of England. She, of course, was a devout Catholic. She was the daughter of Henry VIII's first wife, who was a devout Catholic, and who was also Spanish, by the way. And so there was this rivalry between the two queens. And the seminary in Reims was training young priests to come back to England and to try to drum up a rebellion against Queen Elizabeth and the Protestant government there. So Marlowe was sent there, and he had to be very clever. He had to pretend that he was going to convert from Calvinism to Catholicism, because at that time, the school that he attended in Cambridge, the Corpus Christi College, was the central point of Calvinist teaching. As a matter of fact, Calvinist teaching was the dominant theology at Cambridge at the time. So we have the records of his having gone there, and he came back. Apparently he was very successful in reporting to Walsingham and Burleigh what was going on there. And he wanted to get his master's degree, but he was so good in pretending that he wanted to convert that the authorities at Cambridge did not want to award him his master's degree. They said, we cannot award it to somebody who's gone over to the other side. So what did Marlowe do? He got in touch with Burleigh, the Privy Council. He had a direct line to the top echelon in the British government, and they wrote a letter to the authorities at the university, because Burleigh, incidentally, was also chancellor of the university. They wrote a letter explaining that Marlowe had served the Queen and that he should be given his master's degree. And so that's what happened. Of course, his prestige soared when they realized that here's a common, student who warrants a letter from the Privy Council signed by the top people in the government. I mean, all of a sudden, they realized, hey, this guy is something. He does nothing. Now, Marlowe had gone into Corpus Christi College with the idea that he would become a member of the clergy, that he would take holy orders. But you see, this burgeoning writing genius had other ideas. And so he took his latest play, Tamburlaine, which he probably wrote most of it while he was at Cambridge. He took it to the theater, to probably to Henslow, and they produced it, and it was a smashing success. It was so well received that they told him to write a sequel right away. And so he wrote Tamburlaine too. And that made him famous, instantly famous as a great playwright. And after that after Tamburlaine, he wrote Dr. Faustus. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Dr. Faustus, which incidentally is the most Christian play to come out of the Elizabethan era. It's about this professor, this intellectual, who sells his soul to the devil for pleasure and power and you name it, you see. And of course, who winds up going to hell. But the play itself is very intriguing because you get all of this theological discussion in it, which is really fabulous. And the person who played Faustus was Edward Alleyne, the great shake scene. You know, he was the one who made this. And the famous line in it, of course, is when Faust asked Mephistopheles, he says, "I want to see Helen of Troy. Bring Helen of Troy to me." And so Helen of Troy is brought to him. And what's the famous line when he looks at her and he says, "Is this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burned the towers of Ilium?" You know, he was so intrigued, and he gives her a kiss, you know, and he swoons. You know. But it's a marvelous scene. Only Marlowe could write scenes like that. Then he also wrote, after Dr. Faustus, he, let's see, he wrote, finally, I think his last, the Massacre at Paris, which was about what happened in France, the Civil War there. And finally, he wrote Edward II. Now, Edward II was a homosexual. So people think of, so a lot of our so-called homeophiles assume that, well, Marlowe must have been a homosexual because he wrote about a homosexual king, but that wasn't the case. He wrote about him because there was fear that James, King James in Scotland, who was homosexual, would become King of England. And so he wanted to show what it was like if you had a homosexual as the king. And he had this favorite, Gaveston, his favorite, and he made him, you know, the top people in the government. Of course, that caused a rebellion on the part of the peers. The peers could not stomach the idea that this commoner, because he is the lover of the king, would now have jurisdiction over them. And so they rebelled against him, and finally Gaveston is destroyed because James in Scotland also had a French lover who was sent there to convert him from Protestantism to Catholicism. Sent by de Medici was sent up there, and also the Duc de Guise, So it's a political play, very much concerned with the events of the times, the succession after Elizabeth. Burleigh and Walsingham were very concerned. Everybody was concerned about who is going to be the head of England after Elizabeth. She's a virgin, no heir, you see. And so they figured they certainly did not want Mary, Queen of Scots, and they were able to get rid of her by espionage and all that sort of thing, and making her part of a conspiracy, and so they executed her. They got her out of the way, and so that paved the way for James to come in. And they knew that James had this problem, but apparently he solved it, because James then married a princess from Denmark and had several children. So that he seemed to have overcome his predilection. I guess a throne is worth, a change like that. He figured if you want to be King of England, he'd better go straight, which is what he did. Anyway, so Marlowe wrote this marvelous play, and incidentally, the murder scene in Edward II is one of the creepiest you will ever read anywhere. It's just so remarkable. The dialogue between Edward and the person who's going to kill him is really a remarkable kind of scene. But Marlowe was a master at creating creepy scenes. Not only creepy, but he knew his audience. He knew how to really get them started. Well, anyway, then we get to 1592, and he's doing some kind of spy work, espionage work in the Netherlands and sharing rooms with several others, including this fellow, Richard Baines. And they're working on, he and this goldsmith are working on how to produce counterfeit coins. And so Baines reports that to the authorities, and the head there was Robert Sidney, who was the brother of Philip Sidney and the brother of the Countess of Pembroke. And Robert Sidney writes a letter to Burghley and explains what's going on. He sends all of these people back to England. And of course, Marlowe is brought before Burghley. Well, of course, Marlowe, over the years, had developed this kind of father-son relationship with Lord Burghley. And so I guess Marlowe must have told him the story, and they let him, go. There was no problem there. And then, of course, the following year, somebody puts a poem on the door of the Dutch church in London, a very anti-immigrant poem in which he mentions Marlowe's works. So the idea was that Marlowe wrote this. Of course he didn't, you see. But the Queen and the Privy Council, they all got very upset about this particular thing, and they decided to find out who wrote this poem. Well, it also turns out that at that time there was a great rivalry between the Earl of Essex, Walter Raleigh, Sir Walter Raleigh, and Essex was able to recruit the two Bacon brothers, Anthony and Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was a great admirer of the Earl of Essex. He wanted to help him, and Essex created his own secret service, his own intelligence unit. And Walsingham had died in 1590, and so Burghley had taken over. Burghley and his son, Robert Cecil, had taken over the intelligence work, and Marlowe was still working for them. Marlowe was very loyal to Burghley because, Burghley was the reason why he was in such great standing with the government. But there was this rivalry. And so the authorities investigated, found out, they went into the home of Thomas Kidd, a writer, and Marlowe had shared rooms with him, and so they found among the papers there, papers which they said were atheistic. And they tortured poor Kidd, and that's spelled K-Y-D, and he revealed, that these were Marlowe's papers, they weren't his, that they were mixed up and all of that, so a warrant went out for Marlowe's arrest. And at the time he was staying at his benefactor's estate in Scadbury, in Kent, and he was going to be prosecuted by this commission that had been created by the Archbishop that was after Catholics, Puritans, and atheists. They were going after everybody who disagreed. And so Marlowe was in great trouble. And incidentally, that whole Puritan thing is very interesting because it was because of the persecution of the Puritans that you have New England. Without that persecution, there would have been no reason for the Calvinists to have settled here in New England. And you have to understand that the Pilgrims got here in 1620, and the first folio was published in 1623. So all of these things were happening at that time. Well, anyway, Marlowe was in danger of being hanged by the commission as an atheist, you name it. He was accused of everything. And he had his enemies who supplied all sorts of things to the government, damning him. And so his protectors, Lord Burghley, and his benefactor, Sir Thomas Walsingham, who was related to Sir Francis, who was gone, they said, well, how are we going to save our genius? What are we going to do? So they engineered a fake death. They said if he's declared officially dead, that closes the case. They can't touch him, you see. Now, since he was a member of the Secret Service, they had no problem creating a new identity, no problem getting him a passport, no problem sending him overseas with a new identity. And that's exactly what happened. And you have to read the coroner's inquest. They had this fake murder, and they had somebody else's body. Whose body did they have? They had the body of John Penry, who had been hanged the day before, 3 miles away from where the Deptford murder was supposed to take place. Nobody was permitted to attend that hanging. His relatives were kept away. Nobody knows where the body was taken or buried. But we know where it was taken and buried. It was brought to Deptford by Walsingham's men, who probably took possession of the body as because all they had to do was show papers that they were in the Secret Service. So they took the body, brought it to Deptford, and that was the body that the coroner's inquest looked at. Now, there were no pictures at the time, no television, so they didn't know what Marlowe looked like. They had no idea. If you said this guy is Marlowe, and everybody agreed, including those who were involved in the plot, they all accepted it. And obviously the Queen knew about all of this, because Burley and the Queen had a kind of pact where they would keep secrets that they gave each other. And so the Queen knew about this, and she approved of as a matter of fact, the so-called murderer was released from prison a month later and went back to work for Sir Thomas Walsingham. So we know that this was a completely staged business. But back in London, they had no idea. They didn't see the coroner's inquest, which was written in Latin and probably stuck somewhere. So there are all sorts of rumors about Marlowe being killed in a brawl over nonsense, and the inquest says that it was a brawl over the bill. Who was going to pay the bill at this place where they were staying and eating? They spent a whole day there. And why would have that been a problem? I mean, since they were all working for the Secret Service, Burley would have picked up the bill. There was no problem with a bill, but yet that was in the coroner's inquest to provide a pretext for this fight that supposedly broke out. Anyway, what happened to Marlowe? Well, obviously he went into exile. He went abroad. He couldn't stay in England. He had a new identity, and we have every reason to believe that he went to Italy, where he already knew his way around. He had been there before, you see. So, and also the plays that he wrote there, the Two Gentlemen from Verona, Merchant of Venice, and other plays with an Italian setting clearly show that the man knew his way around Italy very well. And now, how were the plays brought back? How did the plays get to Shakespeare? How were they brought back to England? Well, since Marlowe was a member of the Secret Service, he probably had access to a diplomatic pouch wherever he was. And he was able to get the manuscripts back to England. They probably went directly to Burley, who was the top man, and Burley probably then gave them to Walsingham, who then gave him to the main character in this whole conspiracy, Edward Blount, Marlowe's executor and publisher. So Blount was the go-between, Sir Thomas Walsingham and Shakespeare. Blount knew Shakespeare, he knew the theater group, and he was able to get the plays to them, and they were produced. Some of them had Shakespeare's name on them, some of them didn't. Some of them were published. You had many of these unauthorized publications of some of the plays that had Shakespeare's name on them, some of them didn't. It's a very mixed bag. I think Shakespeare's name appears on only 9 of the quartos, 9 out of 36, you see. And had the quarto, and had the first folio not been published, probably Shakespeare's name, we wouldn't even know of him today. So anyway, there was Blount, who was the go-between. He was the transmission point between Marlowe and the Shakespeare group, the theater group. And that's how the plays got produced. And that's how, that was the mechanics of the transmission. Now, Shakespeare died in 1616. There's nothing in his will makes any mention of having written anything. Not a thing about plays, not a thing about poems, not even a mention that there were plays that hadn't been produced, plays that had never been published. But all of a sudden in 1623, Edward Blount becomes the publisher of the first folio. First folio is a beautiful big book. They have copies of it at the Folger Library in Washington. I got a copy the other day of a facsimile, one of the heaviest books I ever bought. It's a huge, big thing. This was a mammoth publishing enterprise requiring, first of all, you had to have somebody who knew where all the plays were. And only Ed Blount knew where to find them. Then they had to be edited because some of the plays have additional lines in them which scholars say could have only been written by the author. Well, Shakespeare was dead in 1616, which means that Marlowe was still alive, you see. And incidentally, Marlowe came from a family that had some very long-lived siblings. He had a sister who lived into the 80s, you know. And so he was obviously alive to be able to edit the plays that were being prepared for the first folio. But the beautiful thing about the first folio is that there you have plays that had never been produced, never been published. We would have not even known they existed unless they had been collected by Ed Blount, who knew where they were and knew Marlowe and knew that if he had any, do you have any extra plays, you know, lying in your drawer? Obviously by then, Marlowe was living in England under an assumed disguise, different name, and was able to do the work for the first folio, which was sponsored. The two men at the top was the Earl of Pembroke, which was Marlowe's son, his brother, Ed Blount, his executor, his publisher. I mean, you know, it's an incredibly interesting case where all of these things come together. And Ed Blount is the one figure. As a matter of fact, is when I read that Ed Blount was the publisher of the first folio that made me realize that Marlowe was it. Why? Because Ed Blount covers this whole story from the beginning to the end. He knew Marlowe when he was just starting out as a playwright, way back at the beginning. And he knew all about, then he published Marlowe's Hero and Leander posthumously with a great dedication to Sir Thomas Walsingham and a great tribute to Marlowe, even though he says, you know, our poor deceased poet. And then, of course, he winds up knowing Shakespeare and the Shakespeare Company, and then finally he winds up as the publisher of the first folio. You know, so he spans the whole thing. He's there from the beginning to the end. And it's a remarkable story if you put all the pieces together. And of course the pieces have been broken up. It's very interesting. You will find that biographers of Shakespeare occasionally will mention the existence of Ed Blount. He's considered totally unimportant. Some of them don't even list him in the index. And if they do mention him, they just mention him as a name. So the Stratfordians have got it all wrong. First of all, they have the whole thing about the Shake scene. They've got that all wrong. You see, by accepting this nonsense that Shake scene is Shakespeare, they have to account for what was he doing before his name appeared on Venus and Adonis in 1593. I mean, they assume that he wrote all of the plays that are now in the first folio, because some of the plays in the first folio were written way before 1593, like King John and the Henry VI plays. As a matter of fact, the Shakespeareans or the Stratfordians believe that Shakespeare's first plays were the Henry VI trilogy, the three plays, parts 1, 2, and 3, that tell the story of the War of the Roses. Now, if you read those plays, and I have a good deal of it in my book, you'll see that no novice, no country bumpkin from Stratford-upon-Avon could have written these three remarkable plays that required an incredible knowledge of history, of characters, and also an ability to write great poetry, you see. But Marlowe could. And Marlowe probably wrote them for the Countess of Pembroke because she was very much interested in historical drama. She had been influenced by this French playwright, Robert Garnier, who said you should write about history, about historical figures. And she probably paid for it, He was not rich. He didn't have access to lots of money. So my book is full of, so if you read the 36 plays, you'll find all kinds of clues that Marlowe put in. For example, in Hamlet, probably the most famous clue is where Hamlet orders this troupe of players to come to the castle there to perform a play which depicts his uncle killing his father. And so when the troupe arrives, he asks them, he says, gee, I'd like to see a sample of your work. So they ask him, well, what would you like to hear? And he says, well, there was this great play I saw some time ago about Dido and Aeneas. And then he starts to recite some lines. And he says, yeah, that's can you recite that? And so the actor recites, practically paraphrases, 40 lines or so from Marlowe's own play. So there's just one clue. That was a mammoth clue stuck there right in the middle of Hamlet, There are other clues. For example, in Much Ado About Nothing, there's a scene where this lady is jilted by this guy who thinks that she's committed adultery, and so she faints dead. And the priest there says, why don't we pretend that you're dead? And then there'll be all this mourning, and people will feel sorry for her, and maybe this guy who jilted her will come to his senses. And he says to her, die to live. Die to live. Which is what they must have told Marlowe. Die to live, you see. Well, I can cite many such wonderful, wonderful clues that Marlowe dropped into each one of these plays. Even in the last play that he wrote, The Tempest, all of a sudden there's all this mention of Dido. Dido, 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 Why? He wanted to make sure you knew that to the very end, he wrote them all. He wrote them all. Well, anyway, I've talked at length if you have any questions, but I hope you'll buy the book. Give it to your friends and relatives as a gift. That will help me. And I need all the help I can get. If you have any questions right now, yes?
Well, when you refer to the first folio, didn't Ben Jonson dedicate that to Shakespeare?
Yes, of course. Well, of course.
How do you explain that? Why
Well,
would Ben Jonson do that?
Diana Price wrote a very interesting book entitled The Unorthodox Biography of Shakespeare. And in it she says this was probably put up by Ed Blount, who wanted cover. You see, they had to put somebody's name on this incredible production. Listen, the first folio is only second to the King James Version of the Bible as a publication. It's probably the major secular publication in all of English literary history. Now you're bringing out this huge book that was selling at a high price, 36 plays. They couldn't put Marlowe's name on it. They had to put somebody's name on it. And they also were able to get these people like Johnson, who incidentally was indebted to the Pembrokes. He was also getting support from them. You had all these others who were able to write these beautiful poems about this great Shakespeare, who had been dead for, let me see, what was it, 6 years. He had died in 1660, no, 7 years. Yes.
Well, what was Shakespeare's education?
None that we know of. There's no documentation at all for Shakespeare's education. Now, he lived in a town that had a grammar school, but there is no documentation that he actually attended it. He was probably working for his father, who was then a glove maker, a tanner, and also they say he was also a butcher. But as far as we know, he certainly did not attend the university. And as far as we know, every Shakespeare scholar will say, we don't know, there is no documentation on his education, but we assume that he must have had an education because only an educated person could have written these plays. You see that? It's on that basis that they create out of whole cloth these fictional biographies of Shakespeare. Yes.
When did the doubt of the authorship first circulate?
Actually, the doubt about the authorship began rather early. It began back in, incidentally, I just want to state, it began back in 1780 when the Reverend James Wilmot, an English clergyman, became very much interested in Shakespeare, and he wanted to write a biography about it. So he went to Stratford, lived there for a while, and he traveled in a radius of 50 miles around Stratford looking for anything that would relate to Shakespeare as a writer. Books, letters, you name it, manuscripts. He came up with nothing. Absolutely nothing. And so he concluded that, hey, this guy Shakespeare didn't write these plays. He couldn't have written them. And so he left Stratford very disappointed. And because of what he had discovered, he had all of his papers burned when he died. Now it's interesting that Graham Phillips and Martin Keatman, in their book, The Shakespeare Conspiracy, write, the life of Shakespeare is shrouded in mystery. There is no record of him receiving an education, buying a book, or writing a single letter, and no original manuscript of a Shakespeare play survives. There is no direct record of his conversations, and no one in his hometown seems to have known that he was a successful playwright while he was alive. There is not even a contemporary portrait to reveal his true appearance. As a matter of fact, if you look at the portrait on the first folio, it looks like a mask. It looks like a mask over a face, you know.
Is this it, Sam? Is this what you have?
No, that's not the portrait. That's one of the false portraits of Shakespeare that was painted long after the first folio, you know, from somebody's imagination. You know, and Mark Twain, who had read Shakespeare's will, and he wrote, "It named in minute detail every item of property he owned in the world, houses, lands, sword, silver-gilt bowl, and so on. It mentioned not a single book. The will mentioned not a play, not a poem, not an unfinished literary work, and not a scrap of manuscript of any kind. Books were much more precious than swords and silver-gilt bowls, and when a departing person owned one, he gave it a high place in his will." So there's nothing in the will that says that. And incidentally, Diana Price's book, Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography, she writes, quote, she went through all of the documents related to Shakespeare, all of the deeds, all of whatever was there, and she says, "These documents account for the activities of an actor, a theater shareholder, a businessman, a moneylender, a property holder, a litigant, and a man with a family, but they do not account for his presumed life as a professional writer." So there you are. You really have two stories here. You have the story of Shakespeare and the story of Marlowe. Shakespeare was not a writer, but Marlowe certainly was, and he had the genius to write the plays that are in the first folio. Anybody else? Don't forget, buy the book.
And the book will be available, this is being taped in late May of
Well,
08, so.
at the end of June, but I believe you can pre-order it now by going on to, type in the title of the book, The Marlowe-Shakespeare Connection. And it's on this brochure. You all got the brochure, I hope. The Marlowe-Shakespeare Connection, just type that in. And all sorts of things will come up. Target, it's now being sold by Target, it's being sold by Google, being sold by just about anybody who sells books, and also the publisher himself, McFarland Company.
And this will be the debut talk you gave, right here in Lord Wakefield, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you folks for attending. Again, we have a lot of functions coming up in the next month or so. Summer camp, the July 4th information tables, the meetup meetings, and of course Sam Blumenfeld speaking in Dedham on Tuesday, June 10th at 7 o'clock at the Endicott Estate. And the topic will be on the deliberately dumbing down of American education. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming. Have a great weekend, and God bless you.
Is it documented when Marlowe was at Cambridge University?